Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tarrant.
And this is the third of our series on AI and its role in leadership, cultures, value, and all these other ideas that seem to be so interesting and yet untapped. Lots covered in the first couple of episodes, and it's interesting. We recorded those a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still uncomfortable because while we tackled or at least addressed some of the questions, I'm still nervous there's a bunch of questions we haven't even thought of yet. But certainly we talked in the last episode about values and culture and the fact that AI doesn't inherently have those and that people do, and that these things are to some degree programmed, but there are risks in that there's a feedback loop as well. And so I think we talked very briefly about racist chatbots, unbelievably. We also sort of touched on this idea that the control over who is describing what these cultures and values are, in that rather than it necessarily being a CEO, to some degree, it might be a computer scientist doing that. And we also touched on this idea of responsibility, and that while AI might make decisions or might make recommendations, I think it's the responsibility for the decision that still has to sit with a human. And I don't know whether this was a sort of a depressing place to finish, but one of the questions was, does being a manager in this new AI world, if you really take it sort of to its furthest extreme, does it mean you're the one that says no to the computer? Is that the sum of managerial responsibility? I don't think that's true. I think there's a lot more, but this idea of managers perhaps losing control, or at least the definition of control and management and leadership changing when the human element that was there and made such a large part is replaced by AI.
In the last couple of weeks, I've been sort of reflecting on some of the conversations we had, but I've also interestingly had a couple of conversations with people who are very involved in the AI world. And one of the conversations I've had was with a group of very smart people from a company that is very close to here in Oxfordshire. Well, they are based in Oxford, called Opsa. And they make software for autonomous vehicles. And they, rather than building robot cars like some of the perhaps more famous autonomous vehicle companies, they are focusing on the AI software that underpins the vehicles. And
so the operating system for the vehicle,
operating systems and the networking that allows autonomous vehicles to work. And I think they're mostly focused on vehicles that will operate off the public highways, so in industrial sites, farms, quarries and mines, container shipyards, those sorts of things, where actually there's probably less of a prescience or a precedent for autonomous systems to have learnt how to operate. And there's probably more edge cases in these quite dangerous, dirty environments. But what was really interesting in my conversation with them was how much they focus on the explainability of the decisions that the system is making. So they are very, very conscious around all the things we talked about when it comes to the responsibility for when things go wrong, and the auditability and the accountability and the learning process, and making sure that not only are their systems safe, but they are explainably safe. And when things inevitably do happen, either as a result of mechanical failure, a system failure, a technical failure, or human error, there is an audit process that will allow them to be able to explain how and why their AI systems made the decisions they did. And they're at the cutting edge in developing explainable AI decision making. And I thought that was really, really interesting. I'm sure there are other companies doing very, very similar things. But I think this week I'd like to sort of explore some of these concepts and take it a step further when we talk about decision making. And I want to focus really on AI's ability to either directly conduct surveillance or enabling organizations or people to conduct surveillance. Because I think this idea, perhaps when you first think about it, is a bit creepy. It's about the network system being able to watch what is happening. And I think for very, very good reasons, that makes people a little bit uncomfortable. But it has a very, very direct relationship between knowledge, because if you are conducting surveillance, you are gathering information, you are gathering knowledge, and directly because of that, you have power and influence. And I think it reaches into every aspect of human existence, society, culture, philosophy, ethics, law, security, how nation states function, how organizations function. And I think it's particularly relevant for our podcast, where we are looking at leadership and decision making, to sort of explore where AI is going, but also its knock-on effects on some of these other aspects of society.
It feels like we may have some precedents here, and you gave a really good example. I think it was the last episode about Google Maps, how we don't think of that as AI in terms of systems gathering information. And I agree with you, it is both good and bad. I would like a system that tracks traffic in order to make better decisions about how you build roads and route traffic. But I'm also nervous that if someone wants to know where I was last Thursday, they can go look at the traffic. So there's that. But if we,
that's the whole surveillance paradox, and I think we're going to get into that.
The example
are real benefits.
The example I was going to give is CCTV, and I didn't realise this, but I believe the United Kingdom is one of the most surveilled countries in the world because we invested in the 80s in CCTV.
Yeah, London, whether it still is or not, it may have been overtaken by some of the cities in China, because I know they have recently caught up a lot. But London, for a long time, if it's not still, is the most heavily congested CCTV network of any city in the world.
But my understanding is the knock-on effect has been that most places that were no-go areas with CCTV footage now, actually they are policed and safer because people know what's going on. So I think that was the point I was making, which is this idea of, exactly as you say, this paradox, which is people go, I don't want CCTV watching me, but I'm quite happy that now my residential area is much safer and the incidence of crime has gone down because there's cameras watching. So
and I think whilst we're on this subject, we'll just deviate slightly away from AI for our international listeners, because there is currently an awful lot of fake news, in the words of Donald Trump, about London being an incredibly dangerous city. I can see how if somebody from outside of the UK was listening to this, they might think that the CCTV network has either somehow exacerbated crime and violence or not done the job it's meant to do. It's worth pointing out London has lower crime rates than Paris and Berlin and almost every major city in the US. So anything that you read online or see online about London being full of knife crime and violence and you can't walk the streets at night safely, it is very politicised and probably not
statistically and factually not correct in the way it's being portrayed.
Yeah.
It's funny, I was talking about this to someone else the other day where I was my son is just about to go travelling, and we were talking about the fact that could be dangerous for a young person to go travelling. And the reasonable answer is, it's like everywhere, you need to be thoughtful wherever you travel. And the example I was going to give was, for example, when I was growing up, if you went to the King's Cross area, which is an area in sort of to the north of London, at 2:00 on a Saturday morning, that was highly dangerous. In fact, now, if you were to go to the King's Cross area at 2:00 on a Saturday morning, you'd see lots of people coming out of some very shishy bars.
Yeah.
Because actually it's incredibly safe and affluent, and there's lots of money being spent.
So I think that's a very long way of saying there are some real benefits to having more data and understanding systems and watching what is happening. And there are also some risks and some negative aspects. And like the last few episodes we've done on AI, I think we are not saying AI-enabled surveillance is the panacea and it's going to be brilliant, and we're not saying it's terrible and we need to tear it down. I think what we're saying is we need to understand the impact it's going to have, and recognise the leadership challenges, the organisational challenges, and, as we've said previously, recognise that this is coming and we need to be ready. We need to be able to identify the warning signs and react appropriately.
Do you think this is a new challenge, or do you think this is a new form of an old challenge? I mean, I gave the CCTV as an example. Do you think there's anything inherently different about the AI aspect of this?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I think we've got to be really careful with all new technologies, with all sort of uh, generational change. It's very easy to say, you know, everything was better in my day, and that's kind of, you can go back to, I think it's either Socrates or Aristotle or one of the early Greek philosophers, quite famously said something about the next generation. They're all lazy, they're not hardworking. The new technology is ruining them. In fact, it was Aristotle, and obviously the next generation was Plato.
I mean, I
This
agree
is
with all of
this is a
this, but
common.
I've got to tell you, the next
Yeah.
generation, they're a bunch of, well, wait.
And so it's very easy to go, well, this goes through history, but this time it's different. So I've got to be really careful. Do I think that AI is fundamentally different to some of the other generational paradigm shifts in society? No, I don't. And I think there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of overblown fears, exacerbation, exaggeration of the realities of how AI is going to change the world. However, it is going to change the world. So I think in terms of why is it different to some of the other fears we've had about surveillance, I think I would argue that this is probably similar to the invention of the printing press in terms of a paradigm shift in information, because the CCTV camera networks, these are about sensors, things that collect information. What we're talking about with AI is the ability to interpret and understand information. So the difference between this technological change in surveillance and some of the other ones we've seen is the fact that this is about the network and the system working and the speed at which it works. That said, like all technological changes, we will adapt to it and we will use the technology. And I was listening to something the other day that talked very, very well about this. AI is not a single network. I think we sometimes fall into this trap of there is just one network.
Well, I was going to say, I think
like
I put googly eyes on a box last time we were talking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is something in the networks and the connections and the fact that, you can reach around the world. But there are competing AI systems and there are economic, commercial and moral incentives to keep them separate, and in fact to get them to compete against each other. So what we're doing is creating a market for AIs to mitigate each other's effects. So I think what we will see is a huge change in the speed of decision making. This is slightly different from introductions of things like camera networks, things like space-based surveillance technology, things like the proliferation of uncrewed air systems that we've seen over the last 2 decades. Drones, UAVs have changed the way that surveillance happens on battlefields, but also, in city centres. But this is different because of the connected nature and the fact that it's used to help or just on its own understand the data.
I mean, I think this is saying the same thing, maybe from a different way. There seems to be an unprecedented explosion of how much data there is out there, combined with an unprecedented explosion in the ability to interpret and gain insights from that. So
Yeah.
I think I've told this story many episodes ago that the Acrobat team once instrumented their software to see how customers were using it. And they excitedly told me every day they got 4 gigabytes of information. And I said, and what do you do with it? And they looked at me and went, what do you mean? What do we do with it? It's 4 gigabytes. How can we do anything with it? In other words, there was a large amount of information, but you couldn't process it.
Yeah.
This seems to be that common at the two.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. I think that, like all systems, though, some people will be able to use that to great effect and others won't. And we've already talked previously on the episodes on AI about the amount of AI slop that is being generated in the creative world. So images and videos that are just filling up platforms like YouTube and Pinterest with just junk, crap, slop. In a similar way, AI can be used to generate lots of fake information, lots of false information. So it can overwhelm your systems and be used effectively to counter your ability to understand. So there's a balance, and people will be trying to introduce toxic data. And by that, I mean things that affect your algorithm such that the outputs are not what you want, deliberately for economic gain or for political gain. And so there will be this cat and mouse contest of, is my AI able to detect your AI's ability to undermine my AI?
Just to play around with this, and I was just thinking as you were saying that, we've talked about from a business perspective, when you are talking about competition and when you're thinking about what they're doing and you're thinking about how you need to react to that, it hadn't struck me that it is totally reasonable that you would say, I'm going to, in inverted commas, employ an AI to give my competitor false information.
Yeah.
I'm going to publish information that is not true and is likely to encourage them to go down a different route, which I want them to go down because it's the wrong route.
Yeah.
And I think that's your point, is governments can do this, militaries can do this. It's a new angle of, how do I hinder people making good decisions?
Yes, but equally, these things can be used for the good of society, and so there will be this constant competition, and where you have competition, you have economics. I think it's worth, at this point, just really narrowing down what do we mean by surveillance, and it's a term that gets banded around a lot, and I think most of us have a sense of what it means, but there's a very specific meaning to the word surveillance, which is to watch something over a period of time to derive understanding of that thing. And that could be a piece of ground. So you might watch it from space with a satellite system, does an overpass once a day or twice a day or whatever, and over time you are building up an understanding. So we see these images in the news of the damage. So a good example is the US strike on Iran at the back end of last year on the nuclear sites at Natanz. Very, very quickly, we were seeing released open source imagery of those facilities, and people were making commentary about the damage. So you build an understanding of things changing over time. You could watch a person. So using CCTV networks, you can track where people go or where they have been. So if you are the police or the security services, and a crime has been committed, you can go and look at the archive footage and then track where they've been. So you are watching the trend of behaviour. You can do it in real time. So if you're monitoring for security purposes, the safety around a football match or a large event, or just routinely, at train stations or public areas, you can watch a platform or the car park or whatever it is, and over a period of time, you're looking for anomalies, you're looking for things that are potential risks. So surveillance is about watching things to understand them. Now, all the examples I've given there are visual, because I think that's the easiest thing for us to imagine and sort of understand and think about. But of course, you can surveil in communications, electronic media. You can do surveillance of electronic systems to watch for the same anomalies. So I think last week's episode, we talked about companies that used to make things now providing services. So Rolls Royce famously providing engine hours, flight hours, rather than building aircraft or aircraft engines. They are surveilling all of the components within those systems using thousands of sensors in order to watch for anomalies, to understand the system and see the effects of weather, degradation of fuel, and all the other things that bird strikes and whatever, to anticipate when repairs are going to be needed, when parts need to be changed, when services need to be carried out, when audits and inspections need to happen. So you can do surveillance in a whole myriad of different media against a whole load of different data points. You've got financial forensics, where people watch the trends of money moving around the financial systems. And if you are a hedge fund, you might be looking for something that other people haven't spotted in the trends in order to invest. If you are a security agency, you might be looking for where money has been laundered. So you're following the trace. So surveillance is a very, very specific thing, but it has a whole wide range of utility. I think what's worth talking about now is how AI is going to change the world of surveillance. Some of the challenges in the past have been gaining access to the information or gaining access to the thing that you want to watch. So in the military, we used to talk about intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. And one of the challenges was about getting your surveillance team or your reconnaissance team, on the ground into a position where they can see the enemy. And that's incredibly risky. It takes a lot of planning. It's hard work, and they can only be on one spot on the ground. Now we've got space-based satellites and drones. Actually, getting the sensors to the points where you want to gain the information is a lot easier. The challenge now is about interpreting that information, working out what is happening at a speed of relevance that is effectively faster than your competitors. So they are not able to deceive you. And we've talked about putting false information out there. And they're not able to make decisions faster than you. And we've talked previously about OODA loops and stuff. AI is going to allow systems to run automatically and then highlight to you when those changes are happening, when those anomalies happen at machine speed.
So there's a very interesting, I was going to say confliction. There's a very interesting result here. In my world, we talk about the evolution of AI in the product world in the sense of, let's just talk about reporting. You've got a bunch of data, and in the old days, someone would give you a large spreadsheet and they would say, somewhere in that spreadsheet is the data you want. And then someone said, hang on a minute, rather than give them a spreadsheet, we can make a dashboard where that information is presented visually in a clearer way, where you will build an understanding from the data, a dashboard. The next thing as we move into the AI world is people don't want dashboards, they want insight. In other words, that's fine that you've given me these 35 data points. What does that actually mean? And so the overly simplistically, AI says, I'm not going to show you a dashboard because you don't care. What I'm going to tell you is these are the 3 pieces of information you need to make a decision. Fantastic. And I think that's what you've talked about. But the final step, which makes things really interesting, is action.
Yeah.
And so, and this is a really interesting decision-making human being kind of a thing. In a sense, the statement might be, your engine on this particular aircraft is running hot. And so therefore, the insight and the recommendation we give you is that you send out this part. As people become more comfortable with the AI and the recommendations, the next magic thing is, why am I telling a human being to send an engine out? I will do that. So now we've gone from here's some data, good luck. Here's a dashboard which helps you summarize that data, to never mind the data, here's some insights, to we have some insights, and now we're going to action those insights, and we're not going to involve human beings. That happens over a period of time, but that's a theory.
Yeah.
What you've just said to me is really interesting, because you've got, I'm making this up, I don't know, you are surveilling a military target, and everyone claps and cheers because now an AI says, we can tell you where this target is.
And what it is.
It tell you all these amazing things that otherwise were very difficult and time consuming. The next step becomes, well, if you're going to tell me to fire some artillery at this point, why tell a human being? Because that's a bit of a waste of time and energy. We're just going to press the button. We've got this really interesting point now where does the decision-making loop become a bit wonky because there's no human there anymore? And I'm compressing these things as if they happen all at the same time. I think they evolve, and I've fired artillery for the last 10 times when I found that out, so now the computer will do it for me. But that's so interesting, because the other aspect of this is each time the computer makes the decision, you lose control.
Yeah.
And that can be a good thing, because the computer gets it right more often than I do. I'm happy to give up control. Or it may be, wait, what did you just do? I didn't say you should do that. You connected 12 dots and came up with an answer that's not right, or I wouldn't want.
So there's a couple of things there, and I think let's stick with that military example of finding a target, launching artillery at it. We're now in a military space talking about weapon systems that move at speeds that need engagement times that are beyond human reaction times. So you'll probably be aware of the Phalanx weapon system on Royal Navy and other ships.
So this is a close-in weapon system. Effectively, it's a machine gun, but it's a Gatling gun, so it fires lots of bullets.
It's a machine gun with a radar.
And it's effectively last-ditch close-in weapon system. It's last-ditch, missiles coming at it, it will shoot it out of the sky.
But because those missiles are coming in at multiple times the speed of sound, and they are probably coming in at weird angles because they are designed deliberately to mitigate the effects of defensive weapon systems that are trying to shoot them out of the sky, a human controlling a machine gun wouldn't be able to shoot it down. So instead, we have a radar that finds a lock, tracks, does some anticipation, does some maths about where in the sky that missile is going to be by the time the bullet time of flight has gone from the gun to the target. So there's probably a laser rangefinder, or the fidelity of that radar is such that it has very, very accurate speed, distance, time, does those calculations and fires the machine gun at a point in space where it anticipates the missile to be, and then shoots it out the sky. A human can't do that. So we're already at the point where we have machine systems that are engaging weapons because they are beyond our speed.
To be fair, though, the human will have turned it on.
At the moment, we're in a space where the human turns the system on when the threats are around, or in anticipation of incoming threats, and the human has the ability to turn it off and say, we're not doing that. So we talk about this being a human on the loop. So if you do nothing, once the system is engaged and ready, it will track targets and shoot at them. If you don't want it to do that, you have the ability to override it. So we're already at the point where the human is taken out of the decision-making loop and is only put back in if they want to stop it. What we're talking about with AI is the ability to automate that whole decision-making process. So your example about artillery systems, so what we're talking about is firing a piece of metal that is probably going to explode at the other end at a target. There are decisions to be made, calculations about speed, distance, time, trajectories, ballistic profiles, fusing when you want that thing to detonate, at what angle you want it to detonate and hit target for best effect. At the moment, a lot of that is done by very, very clever, well-trained artillery people in the artillery firing system. More and more, that is being automated. We are at a point where we could say, I have a camera on a drone that is being flown in a profile decided by a computer, by an AI, because it's flying the optimum profile to be able to find targets given the endurance of the system and what the system knows about other drones, etc., etc. It finds targets. It uses what we call computer vision to identify that target. So it will look at a reference library, it will look at the image that it's seeing, and it will classify that as a target of some sort, let's say a type of tank. And it will look into its reference library and say, this is this type of tank. It will then go to the next stage of saying, this type of tank, we think, based on our understanding of the enemy's armour, is best protected at the front because of the glacis plate. Top attack is the best way of doing this. It will tell the weapon system that's going to engage that it needs to do a top attack, and it will feed all of that in so that the weapon hits the target, even though that is a moving target. And this is a dynamic system. At the moment, most of that is currently a human-machine system. So we have laser rangefinders, we have intelligence analysts, we have radars, we have drones. You could imagine a world where there is so much happening on the battle space that a lot of this has to be done by autonomous systems, has to be enabled by an AI command and control system. But I think there's limits to that, and I think there will be counter systems that are trying to feed false targets in, that are trying to deceive. And so I think there will always be humans in this system to a greater or lesser extent. But I think what's interesting is we're talking now about how this AI is going to enable militaries to do things. What we haven't talked about is the negatives of that. And you could apply this to policing and security. You could apply it to banking security. Once you've got systems that are very, very good at automatically operating in a particular way, and they've been designed for good, they've been designed to better secure our money, to spot fraud or crime, allow military forces to be efficient and keep people out of harm's way, when they fall into the wrong hands and are used for malign purposes, the same amount of power exists. So if you can spot criminal activity using automated systems, then criminals can use automated systems to hide criminal activity. And this is where you end up with things like state overreach. You end up with this cat and mouse game of, well, we need this system to beat their system. And then things like guardrails, things like civil liberties get diminished, eroded, pushed out of the way to allow these systems to operate, because we must move fast. We've got to move faster than the threat. And this poses some really big societal challenges. And I think that's where we are with AI and surveillance.
Well, let's take a quick break. And these things are so interdependent. The things we've talked about over the last 2.5 episodes all relate to one another. When we come back, I want to ask a question about control, because I think a lot of this comes down to how we as humans think about, as leaders, as managers, think about control. So we'll be straight back after this, and hopefully dig in a bit more. This is another one of these episodes where I don't know whether I'm going to finish the episode with a big smile on my face, but let's see. After this break, we'll see you in a second. Welcome back. Just before the break, Gareth was talking about a world that is fundamentally changing in terms of the information that is available, the ability for AI systems to process this information and do something about it. We talked in the military world example where the AI can process information faster than a human and make decisions which often, typically, most of the time, we would want them to take. But you also talked about the fact that we need to think this is not just the military, this is in the civilian world. My question, it's a vastly oversimplified question, which maybe isn't useful in that sense, but do we have a problem as humans with losing control?
Yes.
And this is a philosophical question, but it leads on to how we think about this, because over the last couple of episodes, we have given plenty of examples where AI is going to do amazing things. Whether you're a military, whether you're a civilian, it will do amazing things. And if it does it right, there is no other way we could achieve those effects. It's incredibly positive. There are other examples, probably more examples than we might imagine today. I think your example of a banking system which says, I've taken all the money out of your account because I think you're a drug dealer. You say, wait a minute, what do you mean? There's lots of bad examples as well. It would be easy to take both sides of this. In other words, if you felt that AI, as many of the unsurprising people who are heavily invested in AI say, yes, there are bad things that can happen, but believe me, if you relinquish control, this will be good for you. And by the way, this is just a human hang up about control. And actually, for example, you gave the brilliant example of the close-in weapon system. A computer will operate faster than a human being. And so I would imagine, in general terms, the ship's company would be very pleased to have an AI pull the trigger or not pull a trigger.
Yeah.
And so therefore, why are you even worried about control? Well, what if it isn't a missile coming towards us? What if it's a friendly aircraft coming towards us? So this idea of, but I want, rather than sort of be all very philosophical about sort of there's good and bad in the world, fundamentally, as human beings, from a leadership and management perspective, do we need to get over ourselves and be willing to give up more control than perhaps we would today? Or, I'm giving the opposite perspective, should we hold even more tightly onto control and say, that may be true that 9 times out of 10, 99 out of 100 will make the good decision, but we absolutely must retain control and guardrails, because not only might it be wrong in 1 out of 100, but more importantly, over time, there might be unintended consequences which we need to. Do you know what I mean? This idea of control.
Yeah. So you've asked 2 questions. First question was, as humans, do we have a resistance to relinquishing control? And I think the answer is absolutely yes, we do. Is that a bad thing? Probably not. We have that, I think, because, and I'm not an anthropologist, but I think we've got that because we operate as a collective species. Our ability as a species to be effective, to thrive, is to work together in groups. And that means we've evolved to build really, really strong bonds of trust. But then when new people come along, we have very, very strong feelings of protection about our tribe, about our team, about our group. But a really good example of that is football teams, sport. We get very tribal about sport. Sport's a really healthy thing in societies. It gives us a pressure release. It gives us something to be competitive about without needing to
Kill each other.
Well, without needing to find competition in, non-regulated ways. But we get very, very attached to our group, our families, our communities, our neighborhoods, our sports teams. And when people come from outside, we are resistant to relinquishing power and control to them. And that's generally because we don't know who they are and we haven't built these trust relationships. Now, we've created mechanisms that allow us to operate globally. So money is a really good example. Money is a mechanism for trading trust without needing to spend time building those relationships. It only goes so far. One of the challenges with AI is we don't know how it's going to be used. So we've got to be really, really skeptical. We've got to be skeptical. We've got to do due diligence. We've got to ask difficult questions, and we've got to move slower than we might want to, or slower than some people might want to, but also recognise that we have to move at the pace of the competition. And that's where the challenge lies, really. But there's a really good, I think, example of this. Back in the early 1980s, shops and big institutions started introducing barcodes. And there was a huge amount of resistance to barcodes. Why? Because it was something we didn't understand. It was a computer that was able to make decisions and track behaviours. There was a massive backlash from parts of the Christian community around barcodes, because they saw it as
The devil's work?
the devil's work. And part of that...
I don't remember reading that in the Bible, that barcodes was a sign of the devil.
So part of it is the way barcodes work. The ends of the barcodes are thick lines, which are also very similar to the digit 6 in a barcode, and you've got one in the middle as well. It doesn't represent the 6, but there was this thing going around that, hidden in all barcodes.
They were the same people who said if you played records backwards, it said terrible things as well.
But the fundamental fear was actually that something out of our control is starting to collect more data on us. And they weren't wrong. And we talked last week about how the Nazis were more effective in the Netherlands than they were in other European countries, because before the war, there were better records. And it's about what is happening with the data. And this is where I go right back to about half an hour ago when I was talking about Oxa, this company in Oxford, that are trying to build autonomous systems that are explainable, that are auditable. We have the choice to build these systems. What we've got to do is we've got to work out what is resistance to change because we're scared because we don't understand it. Ludditism. Well, I suppose Ludditism is more fear of it's affecting me in a negative way. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to be replaced by the robot. Fear of the unknown. I don't understand how these systems work, so I don't want anything to do with them. And genuine concerns about how these systems could be manipulated. We could lose control of them. They could create second and third order consequences, because they're all slightly different. And one of the key things to being able to work out the difference here is to be inquisitive and curious about how these systems work, to ask the difficult questions, to test these systems, and then to implement them as slowly as is feasible, such that we have confidence in them working.
And we should come back, because I think that might be the most important question of the episode so far, about how you know how fast to change. But I think your point about understanding what's too slow and what's too fast. Today, I would argue the people who are making those decisions are inclined to say you don't need to worry about the bad outcomes because of commercial reasons. We think we're competing with someone else. Effectively, a different way of saying this is to do what you've just talked about, to work on systems to understand why the decision has been made and audit it. Some might think that's a waste of time that needs to be spent on making their AI better. So I can see this. But your question, which I think is the most fundamentally important and probably the most fundamentally difficult, is how do we know whether we're being useless human beings that are overly scared versus intelligent human beings say we'll do this at the right speed. And here's, again, if anyone thinks this is a philosophical question, you're missing the point, because Google Maps, there was a point at which people said, I'm not following a computer because it doesn't know where it's going. And there was a point where we said, I now trust this enough that I am going to simply use the information. That's an incredibly harmless example, but there is a decision there. I mean, I don't have a good answer beyond it's probably, you probably need to trust AIs more than you do today, but not complete trusting it, which is not a very good answer.
Well,
That makes sense.
So I think, firstly, I think we worry about the wrong things. We worry about the robots rising up and taking over. And I think that's a silly thing to worry about. What we need to worry about is the second and third order consequences of fundamentally changing the way systems work in ways that we hadn't considered. So where am I going with this? Well, if you introduce data points to allow businesses to make better decisions, and then you start to automate them, then there are lots of really good reasons why companies would want to introduce those data systems. Dashboards you've talked about, and this is a well-trodden path, and we've seen it time and time again. If you want your employees to be more productive, perhaps you want to start collecting more data about them. If they're going to work remotely, I want to know whether they are actually logging in.
I was going to talk about this earlier.
Are they actually logging in, and are they doing a 5-day week from home, or are they logging in the morning, walking away, drinking coffee all day and playing on the Xbox, and then, collecting a wage at the end of the week? So I'm going to embed key trackers on their keyboard so I can understand how much they're actually working. But of course, if they're playing on their computer or if they're on Facebook, they'll still be on their keyboard. So I now need to see what systems they're using, and are they using work systems, and are they... It's going to creep very, very quickly to me watching you work from home.
And I think we should talk about this because this almost... You might listen to this and say, well, that's ludicrous because that's a surveillance state and people don't want this, which they're right. Except if you are a business, that is balanced against, but what if I could double your productivity because people are working? Yeah. And I actually think this is such a fascinating question because we said in the last episode, one possible outcome is that you optimize, create a suboptimal system to, for example, retain human beings with the talent you want. In other words, in this exact example where you say, I watch the person's keyboard, you might say, I think reasonably they should be using their keyboard 80% of the day, but I might actually be okay if they only use it 50% of the day because of these other things they do for me. So there's a really, really interesting thing where I was thinking, there is every motivation for a business to treat your human being like a computer or a machine. Yeah. This goes back to sort of the original thing of people coming up with more efficient processes, but that's not what we are as human beings. If you want an efficient process, use a computer. But what if that person who was only using their keyboard for 4 hours a day rather than 6, but they spent 2 hours coming up with the next idea that's going to double the business's revenue? Very, very difficult.
I think the other thing is about incentives. There is an incentive for the company, the organisation, to have their people working longer and harder. There isn't necessarily that incentive for the employee. So it's about balance. And you can take this to any system. It doesn't have to be an employer-employee relationship. It can be a citizen and a nation state. The challenge comes from knowing who's doing what. The challenge comes from knowing what then the system is doing. And then it comes from who's able to manipulate that. So I might have a problem with my employer doing surveillance on me because as a result, they might collect not only legitimate information that is work-related, but they might also start collecting other things about my private life as what we would call collateral, stuff that just happens to be... I might use my emails for personal use and work use, but they need to access them. Well, now they're starting to do AI analysis of conversations that have nothing to do with work, and they're starting to understand more about me. And then that could be used to bias a decision. That could be used to blackmail or bribe. So
I agree,
There's
but
that.
is this not a novel problem? AI perhaps accentuates the problem, but it's not a novel problem. Today, I can stand and watch what you're doing at your desk. I don't need an AI necessarily to do that. We almost come back to first principles. I think we believe this quite passionately, that part of as a leader,
Yeah.
as a manager, to get the most out of your team members, there is trust,
Yeah.
there is empowerment. And so therefore, while it might seem like a good idea to watch what they're doing every minute, empowerment means I'm empowering them to be as effective as they can. There's always the balance, which is if they bugger off and don't do any work. But
Yeah.
I wonder whether this isn't a novel problem. It's just that it's a new form of the problem.
So the problem we're talking about is absolutely not a novel problem. This was a problem for the Greek philosophers. This was a problem for Machiavelli. This has been a problem for large systems and human interaction since the year dot. What we're now talking about, though, is how AI will enable large amounts of people to be able to start to do these things and then not have auditable oversight. So it exacerbates problems that already exist. The challenge of state overreach, for example, or it could be, governance overreach in a employee-employer relationship, doesn't really matter. If a nation state has the mandate to provide security to its citizens, protect its borders, root out organised criminals and terrorists, defend against other nation states trying to impose their will, that is fundamental to what a government is meant to do. They have a legitimate right to have secrets. They have a legitimate right to conduct surveillance. They have a legitimate right to undertake investigations to protect people and provide security. They also, in Western democratic systems, are fighting political campaigns, where understanding people and behaviours and money flows and having insight into people's lives can provide political power. And so you can use things that are designed for good surveillance for really, really nefarious and malign reasons. The best example of that is clearly Watergate, where the CIA and other state surveillance capabilities that were built for security were used to gain political leverage. So state overreach is a massive fear, and we have sections of society that are really, really resistant to government surveillance programs. We have civil rights, civil liberties organisations. We have volunteer legal organisations that stand up for these things. AI is going to make it so much harder to hold people to account, and it will work at a speed and a scale that means it will overwhelm people's ability to understand how people are using surveillance systems, such that we will lose the ability to hold people to account, or we will lose some of that. We will erode some of those abilities. However, there is also a thing called the overreach paradox, where the more you start to investigate, the more you start to try to understand, the more you become beholden on your models and your simulations and your data and your networks and your databases and the information feeds of your AI, and you actually lose less power yourself. So if your system is making all the decisions, then you become impotent and less powerful. At the same time, you drive a trust wedge between the people that you're trying to protect and have power over. So there's some really interesting dynamics from a political science perspective about how AI is going to change the relationship between the nation state and the society, or the government and the society.
But I
But I
think
think that is a just an example of systems, and it will be the same for employers.
I was going to say, I think it's interesting as you talk about it in terms of states. There's no reason why that's not also true within business organizations.
Absolutely not. It's the same.
You're talking about any organized entity or system,
Yeah.
whether it be the military, the state, the business, your local group of whatever. I mean, what it seems, we're coming towards the end of today's episode. What it seems to me is there are many changes that are coming where we can see patterns from the past, but the challenge is that AI and the modern systems are making these things happen more and faster potentially. But we've got patterns that we can go back and look at and say, this is good, this is bad, this is how we deal with it. This idea, though, that I think your Oxford example is such an important and good one. This is a personal opinion. The ability to understand why something is doing something and what it has done is at the heart of maintaining control. Whoever you are, whatever you are, if you throw that away, if you choose to say, I don't care how it made the decision, or I don't care that it made a decision, okay, that you're going to end up in a bad place at some point sooner or later. Don't get me wrong, bad things can still happen, but at least you have a way of controlling it. This idea of that there seem to be more of these quandaries and more happening faster. This idea of who controls the systems is really important. So when you were talking about state overreach, the question that occurred to me was, given that there is a risk of state or organizational overreach in these cases, who should protect against this overreach? How do you protect against overreach? And the traditional answer is, well, it better not be the bloody organization that's overreaching in the first place. In other words, if you're saying we have a government organization that's overreaching what it's doing with AI, the worst people in the world to guard against that is another government organization, because the motivations are all wrong. By the way, that's why organizations or industries shouldn't have members of their own industries being the board that decides whether there was malfeasance. Doctors, I'm looking at you, by the way, and everyone else. But there's similar things. So I don't.
So we go back to what we said earlier. This is not a new problem. So we build, or we try to build checks and balances into our systems. So famously, the US, there are 3 pillars of power that are supposed to hold each other to account.
So I thought you were going to give me a good example.
Let's not dive into that rabbit hole. But in theory, there is the judiciary,
co-equal powers,
the executive, and the legislature. I can never say that word.
It's not.
They make the legislation. So one body of power makes the rules. One body of power enforces the rules, and one body of power manages the executive decisions that set the context for making the rules, and they are held to account by the body that enforces the rules. In theory, let's not talk about, let's make the point that we are in the data and digital age where systems, networks, surveillance capabilities, understanding of people, political systems, media systems are all being eroded by people's ability to understand on a massive macro scale societal demographic information, but also down to a micro scale of individually what makes you get up out of bed in the morning. You think Facebook's 300 data points on every user and all of these things. This is perhaps why we're seeing the erosion of some of these checks and balances. But I think, without wanting to go down that rabbit hole, the point is we are building these systems to make society function better. Some people are building these systems to make more money, but that should be within the wider context of the hand of the market that is guided by, yes, a need and a desire to make profit for shareholders, but also mitigated by the governance and protections that are put in place by external bodies, auditing organisations, the legal frameworks, the wider trust that are given to powerful organizations by the people that they sell things to or get voted in by or whatever it is. So these systems, we have to recognize, no matter how much we expect and witness the AI systems replacing human aspects of employment or human actions, are there for the human society as a whole. And so we can't let our guard down. We can't just let the AI do the jobs and then move on. We have to maintain those checks and balances. We have to maintain those guardrails. We have to audit, hold people and systems to account, and we have to constantly adapt. The challenge here is not the robots rising up and taking over. The challenge here is people using the AI systems for overreach and for the power that it gives them corrupting.
Maybe my sort of final thought on this, which is stating the bleeding obvious, which is, by the way, I agree 100% with everything you've just said. And I think there is both optimism in that we have faced these problems before and pessimism in that it's not clear we've faced this many problems in this short period of time. But this idea of oversight and understanding is made astoundingly difficult. We have said, I think very clearly over the last 3 episodes, we can vaguely have an idea of where AI is going, but we're not foolish enough to claim we know the answer. In the absence of knowing the answers, it makes it doubly difficult to mitigate against some of the bad outcomes on the answers we can't predict. And so that I say that not as a pessimistic statement, but as almost a statement of fact, which is, it almost made me go back. The positive version of that is we need to continue to double down on understanding what the implications are and what people are actually doing to understand whether we have a really big problem today or whether we don't have a big problem today, whether we need to think differently. The other thought I had was, I think there are lots of people who think the market will regulate itself. There's a lot of sort of people believing in the market. And I think that is probably largely true, where a company that says we are going to watch what every employee does every second of the day and makes decisions, at some point employees will stop coming to work for you and they'll go somewhere else. That's what I mean by market forcing.
Yeah.
But I also don't believe the market will solve everything. I think we're very good at human beings optimizing around the market to get what we want.
Yeah, so I would say market forces are quite good at balancing the dynamics inside the market, but we have always and will always need to have external restraints. So we have legal frameworks, we have standards, international standards. We might do a podcast on international standards because it's a really fascinating topic, although it doesn't sound it. We have things like health and safety standards. There's a reason that people can't put cyanide in food because it's a cheap bulking agent, because it kills lots of people. So the market isn't going to regulate that, but the regulators can regulate that. So we have standards, we have governance, we have legal frameworks. We need exactly the same. But more importantly, perhaps, is we need to recognise where the dragons lie. So the normalisation of surveillance is a real challenge. We have given up privacy at very, very cheap costs to the market. Credit card data, the Amazon shopping inventory and the metadata that sits behind your shopping cart is worth an awful lot in terms of knowing who you are. to those large organisations when they aggregate it. To you as an individual, you get a little bit of convenience, but we have normalised that. And there is this normalisation of surveillance to either accept a very slight improvement in efficiency of your daily chores, or just assuming that it's inevitable, the system's too big. So we've got to be really, really careful about what we give away because the short-term benefits over the long-term
It's almost as if we're
risks.
really bad as human beings at decision making. I mean, as you were saying that, over the years, I'm fascinated by 9/11 and the geopolitical results of that. And when 9/11 happened in the US, people said we need to protect everybody. And so therefore, the normal rules of surveillance and privacy,
Yeah,
we will ignore those. No, that's the wrong word, but we
erode.
erode those in
Yeah,
ways that we were considered unthinkable. And as human beings, we're very good at saying, I don't mind if you invade my privacy because I'm doing nothing wrong.
yeah,
And so therefore, I don't mind if you know what's in my Amazon cart, or I don't mind if you know what phone calls I made.
yeah,
That's fine. But if you now wind forward and you start to say, well, some of those rules that were made in this particular context, this is a little bit of a leap, but the United States government feels that they are vindicated killing drug smugglers without due process because they are considered as if they were terrorists, and they've proved we can kill terrorists without having to prosecute them or capture them.
yeah,
The point I'm making is
yeah.
it's this boiling the frog, which is it's all fine until it's not all fine.
Yes,
And as human beings, we're very bad at saying, how could that be? For example, if you'd have said 10 years ago, do you think it is reasonable that federal agents can drag you out of a car and shoot you for no good reason and there'd be no recourse? People would have said you're a crazy person.
yeah.
And as we've seen recently, that is possible. That's less about the political situation per se right now. It is more about this idea of you've got to be really, really careful what you say is okay, because in this context, it might be harmless, but you don't know what context is going to happen next year that people say, well, it was fine before. I
Yeah.
think AI is a really good example here, particularly when we don't understand what the future looks like.
So there's a couple of points perhaps to finish on here, which is you talked about 9/11 and the change in legislation around what intelligence agencies were allowed to do or not do. I mentioned the Nixon Watergate scandal earlier. Well, those two things are related. So the reason that Nixon Watergate happened was the CIA, which is in theory the US's external international intelligence agency. So they're not looking at domestic. They're not really supposed to be focusing on US citizens and stuff that's happening on US soil. That tends to be the jurisdiction of the FBI and other agencies. Watergate created this scandal where information was being shared between different US agencies such that it made it very, very easy for the Republican Party under Nixon to use tools of the state to target individuals in order to gain political advantage. And they were looking for effectively things they could use to discredit their political opponents. After Watergate, legislation was created to stop intelligence agencies, domestic, sharing with intelligence agencies that are international. So the FBI weren't allowed to share information with the CIA without having to go to a judge and get, federal approval. And there's a whole load of complexity in law. But effectively, air gaps were put in place to protect people's civil liberties, to stop government overreach. Those same air gaps were held up as government incompetence when the FBI didn't share information about activities of people in the US that meant that the CIA didn't join the dots and we didn't prevent the 9/11 attacks. We as society have to be really, really careful that we're not hypocritical and that we have long-term memories. The second thing I would say is, I've talked about sort of the normalisation of surveillance and the erosion of sort of definitions of privacy. We have to constantly ask ourselves the question and then collectively ask people in power the question, whether that's, you know, your credit card agency, your bank, your employer, your supermarket, your government. We have to constantly ask them the questions before it's too late as to what happens if, who benefits from, why are these things happening? And we constantly need to question. And one of the things that is the bastion of holding people to account in liberal societies is a free press and the right to protest. So I think I would end on saying AI is going to be something that we see moving quickly by organizations that we don't fully understand. We need to be able to question that. We need to be able to stand up to decisions that are being made and put pressure for people to expose the reasoning behind the decisions that are being made.
I don't think we ended on a depressing note. I think we ended on a cautious. I'm very conscious that the last two episodes I walked away thinking this doesn't look good for us. I don't think that's necessarily the case here, but I think your call for us to be vigilant is absolutely right. And I think sort of bringing it back to the whole purpose of these last three episodes is, as leaders, as managers, as people who both set and participate in the culture, this is our problem. Each of the challenges that we have talked about over the last three episodes has a direct impact, not just on your place in society, but your place in a business. This really is important. And I think it's safe to say we haven't answered any questions over the last three episodes, but I'm hoping it's triggered some thinking that perhaps you haven't done before. And I think that's really, really important. That, for me, is my personal takeaway is we don't know the answers yet, but we better not wait a couple of years to then revisit the topic, because that could be too late.
Yeah.
It has to be something that you talk about and think about all the time, both to maximize the opportunities, but to mitigate the risks.
Yeah, I think we have a choice, and we have a choice as individuals in where we spend our money and who we vote for, and whether we voice our opinions online, whether we go to protests, whether we talk in the pub about what we're uncomfortable with. We have choices that collectively are very, very powerful. But also we have choices in, we build these AI systems. It's not inevitable that these systems are going to take over and we're all going to lose our jobs and that there's going to be 4 billionaires and the rest of us are going to be in penury. We have the choice to build systems that work for us as societies. And we should probably promote the things that are being done to protect the things we value rather than just the things that make our lives slightly easier, or just assuming that somebody else has got this.
Well, thank you for joining us. I hope you found that as thought-provoking as we did. Again, we started this podcast because it saves us going down the pub, and our wives got a bit grumpy about that eventually. We've done this perhaps with less alcohol, but I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been interesting and stimulating as well. If you have enjoyed this, but have strong opinions, we would absolutely love to hear about them. What are the questions we missed? What is it we got wrong? What is it you think was frankly insulting or patronizing that we need to change? We really genuinely would love to hear about this, particularly from these last three episodes. We are available on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com if email is your thing. We are also on Twitter and Blue Sky at battlingwithbiz with a Z. If you've enjoyed this and you want to hear more, please do go ahead and subscribe. And if you want bonus points, tell some friends to go listen to this and see if they find it valuable as well. As we've said time and time again, it's a community of people asking these questions and sharing this information, which really makes the difference. But for now, after the last 3 episodes of talking about AI, I think the next episode is going to be another one of our influencers, and we're particularly looking forward to sharing that one with you next week when you download your new episode of Battling with Business. So for now, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
Cheerio.